Welcome to Oh the Humanities, a podcast produced by the University of New England Center for Global Humanities. Our conversations are devoted to shining a light on the important work being done in the humanities at UNE and other colleges across the U.S. and around the world. My name is Josh Pahigian, and I'm your host. Our guest today is scholar Wendy Pearlman, who is joining me remotely from Berlin. Dr. Pearlman holds the Jane Long Professorship of Arts and Sciences as a professor of political science at Northwestern University. She earned her PhD from Harvard. She has studied Arabic and the Arab world for 30 years and is the author of 6 books and scores of articles and book chapters on the Middle East. Since 2011, she has interviewed more than 500 Syrians around the world about their life experiences. She shares their testimonials in 2 riveting books. We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria, was published in 2017. It was longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence and is a mosaic of personal testimonials chronicling the Syrian uprising, war, and refugee crisis. The second book, The Home I Worked to Make, Voices from the New Syrian Diaspora, published in 2024, is a collection of narratives from displaced Syrians on 5 continents, reflecting on losing home, searching for home, and rethinking the meaning of home. It was recently announced as a finalist for the 2025 Dayton Literary Peace Prize. I found these books incredibly moving. They're both heartrending and hopeful at once, and I look forward to digging into them shortly. But first, let's meet our guest. Wendy, welcome to Oh the Humanities.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And this is about the 12th episode of the show, and you're actually the first guest to beam in from across the Atlantic. So you're our very first international guest. So I'm glad we could get the technology to work and the time difference to work. And in your incredibly busy schedule, I'm so glad that we could find a little time to chat.
Oh, me too.
Where do you head after Germany?
So I have been in Berlin since for about 2.5 months. And I started coming to Berlin in 2016, and this is my 6th summer in Berlin, where there is an enormous Syrian diasporic community that is fascinating and rich and diverse and vibrant. And it has been such a joy to see this community develop over the past 9 years and develop strong relationships with people here. Next week, I go to Southeast Turkey, where I am volunteering with the US-based Karam Foundation that has a center there for to help Syrian refugee youth and supports Syrian refugee youth and their families. And I will be teaching a 5-day workshop on civics and citizenship to Syrian youth in Turkey. And my hope then is after about a week in Southeast Turkey to travel to Syria. That's a trip that I've been thinking about and planning out for many, many months since the fall of the Assad regime in December 2024. When we record this, there is renewed violence and instability in Syria, so I'm not quite sure if I will go or not, but my fingers are crossed that conditions will allow me to go and spend about a month there.
And I've been watching the news, probably not as closely as you have, but I saw there was sectarian violence in southern Syria, and I think Israel intervened with bombing some tanks. Where were you planning to go? Were you going to be in that area that's been impacted recently, or?
No, and most likely not now. I was planning on spending some time in Damascus, the capital, and hopefully visiting some other cities, Homs and Aleppo for sure, and hopefully some others as well. But we'll see given conditions.
Yeah, you definitely want to be safe.
Yeah.
And we want you to be as well. I thought we'd start, as we often do on this show, by offering listeners some insight into the path that's brought you to where you are today as a scholar. At mid-career, you're a prolific author. Your books have been praised by the New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, The Guardian, Publishers Weekly, and so on and so on. But before you were having the impact you're having now, you were a student, like many of the people that will ultimately listen to this episode, my students and other students here at the University of New England. And I believe when you were a student, you're now a political scientist, but I think you started out as a history major at Brown University, if my little bit of homework I did holds true. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about like what some of your influences were as a young thinker, and then also if you could maybe segue into your study abroad experience that you had. If I remember right, you had a study abroad experience in Morocco. And we actually at the University of New England have our own campus. We have three campuses, and one of them is located in Tangier. So I think
Amazing.
I think my students who have been to Morocco would be interested in hear what your experience was like when you had that global experience.
Oh, fantastic. So I think I had sort of a political awakening as a middle schooler. I remember when I was 14, after having spent much of my youth in childhood gymnastics, and when I finally quit gymnastics at age 14, I tried to discover the world outside the gym and became interested in politics. And somehow I fell into the world of Amnesty International and was utterly captivated by the idea of prisoners of conscience and what it even means to be imprisoned for your political beliefs, and that this kind of repression existed in the world and lack of freedom existed in the world. I was growing up in Lincoln, Nebraska, and had nothing in my life had brought me into contact with those types of political realities. But I fell into that and became very active in my local Amnesty International chapter, founded a chapter in my high school, and much of my pre-college life was shaped by that. And I think that was my political awakening and my interest in politics. When I went to college, I decided to major in history. I found those classes to be fascinating and enriching, and wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but history felt like a good social science or humanities background for kind of anything. But that interest in politics was always with me. So it wasn't later until I decided to focus on political science, which when I went into graduate school discovered had as much to do with the science as with the politics. But it was the politics that was the motivation for me to understand the political world, and then later acquired a kind of training that helped me to think in a particular way and approach research in a particular way and learn what it meant to create theory and test theory and collect data and analyze data. So that was later on. But as exactly as your question points to, another big sort of turning point in my life was when I studied abroad. I did my junior year abroad, a semester in Spain and a semester in Morocco. It was actually my first trip outside the United States. I said to myself that I wanted to go to Africa because I felt like I didn't know anything about the entire continent. It was sort of unrepresented in my education. When I began to look at programs to make that a reality, I saw that there was this program in North Africa. And I had studied Spanish in high school and a little bit in college. And I thought, if I spend a semester in Spain, or semester in Morocco and a semester in Spain, I can have two very different experiences essentially on the cheap, because I could buy a single plane ticket and have two radically different experiences by traveling between them by boat. So that is what I did. I had no background in the Arab world or in the Arabic language or the Middle East or anything, but wound up in Morocco. And it was the most interesting experience I had ever had in my life up until that time. Probably because I haven't had that many interesting experiences, but Morocco really took the cake. I studied on the study abroad program sponsored by the School for International Training, which is based in Vermont. And I have many of my own students to this day study on SIT sponsored programs in Morocco. I lived with a local family in Rabat. We started learning Arabic with just the letters. And every day was challenging, often tremendously so, but every day, every second taught me something new and pushed me outside my comfort zone in ways that I wanted to continue. So I essentially became hooked, and I went back to Morocco several times, including spending a summer in Tangier studying Arabic. I continued studying Arabic. I wound up after I finished college, I had a Fulbright grant to study the situation of Moroccan immigrants in Spain, went back to Morocco several times. And then later when I started graduate studies in Middle East politics, my focus was very much on North Africa and Morocco. But saw that, eventually a lot of roads in the Middle East political world lead eastward, and I went eastward as well, and ended up then writing a dissertation on Palestinian politics, and then since 2011 focusing a lot on Syria. But Morocco remains part of my own personal and intellectual origin story, so it's very dear to my heart. So all hats off to your students who take advantage of that opportunity to see the world and experience Morocco as well.
Well, you now join Colin Woodard and Amrita Myers, historians who have been on this show previously, who have offered their testimony about the value of study abroad and stepping outside one's comfort zone and challenging yourself in the way that you described it daily to assimilate into a different community and a different part of the world. And it can be such a transformational experience. So I'm always glad to share that message with my students, but sometimes they tune me out. So hearing people like yourself offer that is so very valuable. That's a good segue into one of the next things I want to talk about, which was your early work was comprised mainly of 3 books on Palestine, Israel, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Occupied Voices, Stories of Everyday Life from the Second Intifada, came out in 2003, and that's a collection of interviews from Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. That was a Boston Globe and Washington Post bestseller. Other book, Violence, Nonviolence, and the Palestinian National Movement, was named one of Foreign Policy's best books on the Middle East in 2011. And then Triadic Coercion, Israel's Targeting of States That Host Non-State Actors, released in 2018, examines the causes and consequences of 70 years of Israel's use of violence and threats against neighboring states to prevent or punish their support of non-state actors on their territory. Back before you wrote all those, in 2000, you spent 6 months living and researching in the West Bank, I believe, and doing the research that led to Occupied Voices. What was that experience like? Did that also take you outside your comfort zone, or by then had you spent so much time abroad, such as in Spain and Morocco, that it was easier for you to think of yourself, I guess, as an international citizen who could assimilate into different places and just get to work? Or is there still that cultural, that challenge of culturally finding your way?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a challenge of culturally finding your way. I still feel it, every day that I'm outside Chicago, which is now the place that call my home. But I think probably nothing was as drastic for me as the first time. But everything, the challenge continues. So in the year 2000, I enrolled as a student in Birzeit University, which is a Palestinian university in the village of Birzeit, right outside Ramallah in the West Bank. I had finished a master's degree and was sort of between a master's degree and a PhD, so I had this time free. As I said, up until that point, my interest in Middle East politics was totally centered in North Africa. But when you start studying Middle East politics, eventually kind of all roads lead to Israel-Palestine. So I thought, this would be valuable to get to know this part of the world. If I really wanted to have a career in studying the Middle East from a political point of view, this would be valuable. I always say that I arrived in Palestine and I forgot completely about Morocco. Palestine was absolutely all-consuming in so many ways. So I both studied at Birzeit, and at that point I had strong enough Arabic that I was allowed to enroll in classes with Palestinian classmates in Arabic rather than having the classes for international students. So that was just a great experience to be side by side with my Palestinian colleagues. And I also began sort of an internship at a Palestinian human rights organization that I then developed a close relationship with. So I wasn't really doing my own research as much as just soaking up what life was like. And it was, I don't think I had any imagination what it means to live under occupation, what it means to be stateless, what it means to be to live in a place that's fundamentally unfree, where an entire society is ruled by another society, where there is restrictions on basic freedom of movement, of in every aspect of life. Israel's occupation of the West Bank affected the lives, the aspirations, the dignity, the rights of everyone I was around. And, um, you know, Israel and Palestine are in the news so much. And I think that many Americans struggle to understand what it's all about. And there are many ways to understand. But if people were, if you ever have the chance to visit Israel, to visit the West Bank, I don't know when people will be able to visit Gaza again, but to visit and be in Israeli society and in Palestinian society, so much becomes clear, and so much became clear for me about what Palestinians were struggling for in terms of wanting to have the basic freedom of choosing their own government, making their own laws, living under their own flag, having sovereignty over their own state in their own homeland. So it was tremendously captivating for me, intellectually, also personally and politically, and it sort of grabbed a hold of my head and my heart, and it didn't really let go. So that was my experience from January to June 2000. From there, I actually went to Egypt on a year-long Arabic language program. So I was in Egypt when the second Intifada began in the fall of 2000. And I realized that I had just spent this time in the West Bank in what was the waning days of the Oslo peace process years. Palestinian and Israeli leaders were still negotiating over what many had initially thought would lead to a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine as two independent states side by side. But by the year 2000, after 7 years of negotiating, both Israelis and Palestinians felt disappointed, betrayed, and felt like the peace process had not yielded what they had hoped. It wasn't clear at the time I was there that things were heading towards a brick wall, but they did, and exploded into violence in the fall of the year 2000. So I was watching these events from Egypt, and this place that I had developed this connection to, and people that I had developed relationships with, and was watching from afar as things fell into violence that got worse and worse and worse. And following the American news, especially, I felt like I saw half-truth, misrepresentations of the Palestine and the Palestinians I knew, and I felt like Palestinian voices were not cutting through a fog of media reporting at that time that I think was particularly one-sided. And I wanted to know what the experience was like for Palestinians. Not to say that it wasn't important also to know the experience of Israelis, but I had just been in Palestinian society, and I felt like I was struggling from afar to know what people were experiencing. So I decided to go back to the West Bank and also to Gaza and do a series of interviews. So this was the first time I ever did interviews with ordinary people, which then launched another love of that, which became the two books on Syria many, many years later. But Occupied Voices was my first book and my first experience of doing interviews. And essentially, I did interviews with anybody I knew and anybody I could in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and recruited classmates and friends to help me transcribe and translate those interviews, and slowly put them together in a collection of personal stories that describes the beginning of that second uprising that began in the fall 2000. The other books are much less interesting. They're very political sciencey books. The second book, Violence, Nonviolence in the Palestinian National Movement, is essentially my dissertation. It's a revised version of a political science thesis. The other book, Triadic Coercion, is co-authored by a dear friend and Israeli colleague, Boaz Etzili, who teaches at American University. That's also quite sort of political sciencey. So that's our day jobs, to create political science theory and try to explain political events. But the first book was my first foray into a book of interviews.
And in Occupied Voices, it sounds like you really hit on a method and a formula that you were able to employ in the two Syria books, like actually centering the voices of the people you're writing about instead of looking at them with sort of the third person lens. I'm curious, this is just kind of a writerly question, I guess. Um, how did you get better? Do you feel, if you did, in the course of writing the three books that really interweave stories from ordinary people? Like the narrative in the two Syria books that I read is just so coherent, considering that it's different people telling their little bit of the story, but it also tells a larger story. So there's an actual narrative arc, and there's suspense, and then eventually there's something moving toward resolution. Um, as a writer, I think that me trying to wrap my mind around it seems like it would be incredibly difficult to get those puzzle pieces to fit. And I'm just wondering, it couldn't have all come just intuitively to you, or how did you figure out that recipe, I guess, or that method?
Thank you so much for noting that. And yeah, so Occupied Voices is a much simpler book. I did a series of interviews with people, and the book is structured by individual. There is a photograph that's actually quite beautiful. I worked with a Finnish photographer who also became a dear friend. Her photographs are just phenomenal. So there's a photograph of a person and that person's story, and it goes, just a series of individuals. There was still quite a bit of sort of editing. You have a lot, sometimes transcripts are 40 pages and you have to edit it down into something that's concise and readable and distills a person's personality, but also meshes well with the others. But it was a much simpler, more straightforward formula. When I got to do the Syria books, it was initially the same method. Do interviews with ordinary people, collect all the stories you can, then figure out how to put it together as a book. But I think I had just matured as a writer, as a reader, as a thinker. Had already done a PhD, started working as a professor, had much more experience writing, and wanted to tell a more complicated story that was not just a series of individuals telling their experiences, but using individual experiences to tell, as you said, a collective story. Um, my goal in We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled was to tell the story of the Syrian revolution, to show what life was like in this authoritarian regime under Hafez and then Bashar al-Assad, why it was that people might want to rise up and even risk their lives to challenge this regime. So it was these beginning stories to bring to life what it's like to live under an authoritarian system, corruption, repression, fear, silence, political arrest, and also a sense of hopelessness that maybe things would never get better. To put into context how amazing it was in the 2011 Arab uprisings that people finally said enough and risked their lives to go out and say and want change, and then bring to life the enormous courage and strength it took for people to go and do that, and then how protest evolved, how it spread over space, how it was sustained over time, how the regime responded with repression, how people took up arms, how this evolved into this multidimensional complex conflict, and then the book ends with people leaving Syria as refugees. So this arc is the arc really of the Syrian uprising and the Syrian conflict, and the most journalistic stories and straightforward books all kind of have the same arc: authoritarianism, uprising, war, flight. And what I wanted to do was keep that same arc, but tell it exclusively through excerpts of the interviews I've collected. So someone goes name, story, and follows the same arc that a standard article would be, or a Wikipedia, article on the Syrian conflict, but sees what it was like to live it, have a sense of the human dimension of it all, what was at stake, as well as the kinds of details about how and why it happened, what it felt like, how it changed people, how people made history, that you can sort of best get through stories. So it was a more complicated and a more ambitious sort of project that wanted to use human interviews on the one hand, but wanted to explain what the Syria conflict was all about, especially for people who didn't have much background and weren't sure where to start. And so this war seems really complicated. Who's fighting whom, and how did this begin, and how did this get so bad? That this would answer those political questions, but in a way that was intensely human. And then the second book is even more complicated.
And I'll get to that one. I do have a
Yeah,
couple more questions about We Crossed a Bridge and
sure.
It Trembled. So another couple, I guess, of writerly sort of questions.
Yeah.
So as a journalist or a political scientist, you want to be objective and sort of removed to whatever extent that's possible from your subject. But as a reader, I felt myself getting so emotionally attached to some of the people telling their stories. I was wondering if that was a challenge for you as sort of the chronicler of this larger story and of their individual stories. Were you ever conflicted by the just the humanity of the project, I guess, and the relationships you must have formed even in the course of sometimes just single interviews, but sometimes follow-up interviews with people?
Yeah, every moment. Yeah, if your heart isn't touched by what Syrians have experienced and are continuing to experience until today, then yeah, you're not paying attention. So there are ways to tell this story that are quite distant and removed, that focus on only elite politics and different actors and their decision making, on international actors, and see it all as some conspiracy or conflict between Turkey and the Gulf and Iran. And um, I knew there was a human story to tell, and it's incredibly moving. It's heart, as you said, heart crushing, but also heart binding again. And I think it's just the kind of entry price you pay when you work on conflict and areas
Mm.
that have experienced a tremendous amount of suffering and violence and pain. Um,
Another question. Can you explain to listeners the title of the book? It comes from it's a quote from one of the interviews. What's the significance of it, and why did it resonate in the way that it did?
Yeah, so the titles of both books come directly from words spoken in one of the interviews, and I feel like it's kind of a treasure hunt in that it's only maybe in the middle of the book that line appears, and if you're paying attention, you read it and you go, oh, okay, now I see where the title comes from, because otherwise it doesn't. It seems a bit opaque. So this We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled is actually from an interview from a man who's talking about an enormous demonstration in the spring 2011. So these are the very heady, optimistic days of enormous mass nonviolent mobilization of Syrians of all walks of life going out to the streets to say we want the end of this regime. And he's describing a demonstration that moves from one town to another, and it actually crosses over a bridge. And he said, we crossed a bridge and it trembled under the weight of so many people. So we crossed a bridge and it trembled sounds quite ominous, almost scary. And it comes from a tremendously happy memory of the ultimate of people's power, a people's power that is so strong that people made a bridge tremble because so many people went out at enormous risk to demand dignity and freedom. So it's something that has its roots in this essence of what I wanted to respect and honor in the Syrian revolution. But at the same time, it became something of a metaphor. Syrians crossed many bridges. They crossed a bridge from authoritarianism to protest, from protest to war. They crossed bridges from the homeland to one country after another of another, and becoming a majority displaced population. And they trembled with the weight of these enormous shifts, and the world has trembled with the way the reverberations of Syria have also um, reverberated to affect country after country. So it was words spoken, but also something of a metaphor for the transformations that this society underwent.
And I definitely read it that way, so I'm glad you could
Yeah.
articulate it though better than I would have. Transitioning to the home I work to make, it seems to me like a continuation of the story. It kind of picks up where We Crossed a Bridge ended. What happened to the Syrians after they left Syria? How did they find a sense of belonging? How did they find that dignity that they were searching for? How did they come to terms with leaving the country that they loved, despite its many faults? They'd hoped to improve it, and to make it a better Syria, but now they've left. So where do they go from there? That's kind of where the book picks up. And I was wondering, did you conceptualize it as an entirely new project? Did you just see it as sort of like a part two? And were you able to did you have to do all new interviews, or were you able to draw from some of the interviews that you had done with displaced Syrians in reference to the topic of the first book?
Yeah, so I began doing interviews for the first book in 2012, and We Crossed a Bridge was published in 2017. And basically, I just didn't know what to do with myself except to continue to do interviews with Syrians. Like, I had just been doing it for 5 years straight. I didn't know what else to do. People's stories were still moving, incredible, uh, fascinating, heart-wrenching, important. So I just kept doing interviews at every opportunity, and would travel and sit with anybody who was at all interested in telling their story and ask them, tell me about yourself and your life, and just record whatever they had to say. So I did not at all have any particular interest in doing something specifically on home or belonging or exile, but these were the themes that kept coming up again and again organically in people's conversations. My interviews are very open-ended. I say to anyone, just tell me about yourself. And I kept hearing people saying things like, I don't know what my sense of belonging is now. Do I belong to Syria, or do I belong to this new place? What does it mean to find belonging anyway? So people were mentioning this term, or talking about the homeland, and what is the homeland? Is Syria a homeland, or is it not a homeland? About finding security, finding peace, finding some place where they could, own the world again and move forward, reconciling with the fact that they might never go back to the place where they were born and grew up, reconciling with the fact that they now had to make new lives in places where they before maybe never even imagined they would visit. And now we're learning new languages, going back to school, raising their kids, adjusting to a new culture, just enormous shifts. And home and belonging was a window into that, those experiences, and the dual experience of, on the one hand, looking backwards to making sense of what had happened to Syria, and on the other hand, looking forward to what it means to be a displaced person. So as I heard people talking about it themselves, then I began to ask about it more explicitly. And slowly I began to think about, this is going to be the focus, that there is value in a second book that picks up where the first book leaves off. So I wasn't even sure I wanted to write a second book, but I could begin to see a new book that began where the other one ended, with a focus on home. So whereas the first book ends with stories of people leaving Syria, the new book starts with stories of leaving Syria, and then follows as people think about what home even means. The first book is very fast-paced. It captures the feel of the time when there's new events, new developments. So there are more speakers and shorter excerpts. The second book also captures the mood of that time, interviews that I did, basically, let's say 2017 to 2023, which was a time of slower events. The pace of battles and the war slowed, and many people who had arrived at some point of relative stability or security where they were almost experiencing this kind of sense of, wow, what happened to me? What happened to us? As one person in the book says, when you're inside the conflict or you're fleeing, you don't have time to think. You're just fight or flight. You're trying to survive. And then many people afterwards, they got to some point where they were no longer in fight or flight mode, entered a new reflective mode where they were thinking back very deeply, very introspectively about the meaning of this whole experience and trying to extract meaning from it and figure out who they were after so many dramatic changes. So the second book is a slower paced. There are fewer speakers, longer excerpts. It's more introspective. It's more personal. And it's a window into how displaced people move forward, and as well tries to think about all the wisdom they have about what home even means. So one of the themes in the book, or the introduction that's in my voice, is that the more you are easily rooted in a clear home, you can take home for granted. You don't really have to think about it much. The less you might have to think about home really deeply, because it's just there. When you're really at home, you don't ask yourself whether or not you're at home. But refugees typically don't have that luxury. Their surroundings compel them to really think, is this home? Is that home? Does home even exist? And that hard work of thinking produces insight, reveals things that we otherwwise might not see. So the book is in some ways an invitation for those who do not have a migration background or refugee background to listen to these voices, to learn about Syria and Syrians, to learn about being a refugee and migration, but also to learn things about home that can be relevant to their own lives in ways that they might just not think about, but appreciate that this is what displaced peoples have to teach them.
Mm. Well, from both books, I certainly learned a lot, not just about Syria, but as you're saying about that refugee experience. I come from a line of Armenian immigrants. I grew up, my great grandparents still spoke almost exclusively Armenian. My father grew up in an Armenian speaking household in this country. And I remember in my childhood, my grandparents pining for the old country and telling stories of the old country. They never went back. They had been victims of genocide, had family members killed before their eyes, and had narrowly escaped. But there was still that pining, and there was still that less than complete assimilation and conceptualizing themselves as Americans, even decades. By the time I came along in the 1970s, it was decades after they had come to this country, but they still had that connection and that internal conflict. So it helped me understand that on a little deeper level. So it got me reflective in a way I wasn't necessarily expecting when I sat down to read the book. In addition to all the scholarship you've produced, I think you've also written a children's book about Syrian refugee spirit. What's the title of that book, and what is its story?
Yeah, so the book is called Muzun, A Syrian Refugee Speaks, and I was the co-author of it with the protagonist, Muzun. So Muzun al-Malehen left Syria in 2012 at the age of 14, and her father told her, pack a backpack with only the most important things. We're leaving, and she packed her backpack filled with kilos and kilos of books, all of her school books. She didn't know if she would be leaving school or ever go back to school again. She was extremely afraid and upset that her education would be disrupted, so she left with her school books. And then she ended up living in two different refugee camps in Jordan, where she became an education activist. She was very eager to go back to school and went back to school and discovered that many families were not sending their kids to the camp school, and especially girls were often not going to the camp school. So she started a one girl campaign of going tent to tent to urge families to send their kids to school. She developed relationships with different NGOs in the camps, and eventually became a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. So it's just her life story, written in a way targeting 14-year-olds, middle schoolers or so, and essentially we wrote it together. Or I did many interviews with her and tried to write the book in her voice, and she contributed as well. And it's her story, and I was a helping writer for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a 14-year-old at home, so
Oh, great!
and an 11-year-old. So I think I'm going to order a copy after we
Oh,
end this
fantastic!
conversation. That's
Great,
wonderful.
great.
Heading toward the wrap up here. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but as you look at Syria today and you imagine what its future might be, do you feel optimistic? Do you feel still that there are such challenges that they might be insurmountable in terms of Syria eventually arriving at a stable place where it can provide a home and maybe even a place people would want to return to that have left Syria in the last decade or two.
Most Syrians on December 8th, when Bashar al-Assad fled the country, were overwhelmed by feelings of euphoria and hope and crying tears of joy. And I think the time since December 8th has been a roller coaster of emotions in which many are still hopeful, but there have been horrific events of horrific violence against civilians and suffering, and people are, I think many people are still holding on to the hope that they have. That, you know, in the beginning months, I was one of many who said nothing can be as bad as the Assad regime. Nothing can be as bad as a regime that drops barrel bombs and chemical weapons on its own people to stay in power. But the events on the ground are incredibly demoralizing and distressing. But I think I still have hope because there is still the possibility of a better kind of politics. I think most Syrians want security. Most Syrians value the multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious dimension of the country as a source of pride and strength. They want the country to recover economically. They want things to be rebuilt. They want a stable kind of politics that respects people's dignity and rights. And I think the majority of Syrians want that. And as long as people want that, then the question is just how to make it happen. I also have a tremendous amount of respect and hope in Syrian civil society. These are the people who went out into the streets and risked their lives to demand freedom. They organized and sustained protest against all odds in the face of enormous repression. They formed grassroots organizations, non-governmental organizations, humanitarian relief projects, initiatives in every domain you can think of, inside the country, outside the country, and did not give up. People have developed skills, knowledge, networks, relationships about how to organize. And I think people are not going to give up on the dream of a better kind of politics without a fight. The challenges are enormous because a country that is brutalized by half a century of dictatorship and 14 years of war doesn't become a stable democracy overnight. What we're seeing now is the inheritance of 54 years of Assad rule that used sectarianism, that used corruption, that used religion, that used security rule, and the inheritance of 14 years in which over 500,000 people were killed, 14 million people displaced, and a country destroyed. So the ills that leaves in society and every person are a logical outcome of that kind of violence. That doesn't go away without a struggle, but it can hopefully be resolved if political leadership is wise, if it is inclusive, if it attends to issues of transitional justice, if it creates real spaces for representation and inclusion. These are all problems that are solvable. I am convinced that all the crises are solvable by the right kinds of political formulas that give all Syrians a seat at the table and respect their rights to have a voice in determining their future. But I'm a political scientist who sees all solutions as politics. But I think the right kind of political formulas this is not a country that is doomed for people to kill each other. It's not inevitable in the nature of society or religion. I see that the source of the problems in the current instability and violence are political. The sources of the problems are political. The solutions are political. And it requires both leadership in Damascus and leadership in society and leadership around the world to want to do what it takes to, whether it's put investment or pressure or words, that everyone is served by a inclusive, representative, pluralistic, rights-abiding Syrian government. And everyone will lose in the absence of that. That should be the top of the agenda for every state watching Syria, and it should also be the priority for the current governmental authorities.
Well, that's really well expressed. It seems like a blueprint to me for stability and what ultimately Syrians want. I just so grateful for the work that you've done, not just in applying your lens as a political scientist, which is well earned through many years of study of the region, but also the role you play as a conduit for everyday people, so that their voices can reach halfway around the world to me and other readers here to understand the experience they've been through and gain the respect and appreciation we should all have. It should be more at the forefront of our mind as Americans. This country sort of on a balance beam, and we're not certain which way it's going to tip. But I'm really grateful for the time you've taken today, Wendy, to share your expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me and for those very kind words.
That's it for this episode of Oh the Humanities. As always, thanks for listening, and feel free to tell us what you thought of this conversation on the CGH social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X.